So that had a huge, a massive emotional time. I read that not once as I sat at the desk, I read it 4 or 5 times.
And that's where the germ of the idea
And I sat in there and I cried.
The architect had taken all the pots and pans and china and delf, wrapped them up in newspaper and put them into cardboard boxes in behind. So it was all just waiting there, waiting to be saved.
It was like breaking into Tutankhamun's tomb or something like that.
Completely, a fabulous gallery kitchen. It's the best preserved kitchen of its type in Ireland anyway today.
Didn't go through.
You've left me no option, I'm afraid.
No, you have to knock her away.
Yeah.
That's it.
So I hadn't intended to do this, but
I thought you were a gentleman, but
no. At the beginning of the 1840s, some 2 million acres, that is, about 1/3 of all the tilled land in Ireland, was used for growing potatoes. And for 3 million Irish people, those potatoes were the only thing they ever got to eat on any regular basis. Remarkably, because the potato was so nutritious, they thrived on them. And travellers to this country would often remark on the healthy, physically robust appearance of the otherwise wretchedly poor rural population. So when the calamity of the Great Famine hit the country in 1845, people naturally blamed the failure of the potato crop. But equally to blame was the prevailing system of landlordism in Ireland that made reliance on the potato so unavoidable and so lethal, and also the widespread attitude among the wealthier and governing class that there really wasn't very much they could do about it. If we still have lessons to learn about the famine that can still be applied to the world that we live in today, then this is a place that can teach us a great deal. Welcome to Strokestown in County Roscommon in the province of Connacht. On a misty day, you might not be able to see your neighbours across the road because Strokestown boasts the second widest street in Ireland, Dublin's O'Connell Street, just about pipping it at the post in the width stakes. But Strokestown has something that Dublin hasn't got. At the end of this street, where you might expect to find a T-junction, you'll find an elaborate entrance to the bygone world of elegance and privilege that was Strokestown Park. Well, I say bygone, but that isn't entirely accurate, as you're about to discover. In the early 1700s, Thomas Mahon, landowner, parliamentarian and businessman, decided he was wealthy enough to enlist the services of celebrated Dublin architect Richard Cassels to bestow a sweeping grandeur to his estate house at Strokestown in the Roscommon countryside. And it was his eldest son, Maurice Mahon, the first Baron Hartland, who decided that any visitors to step across the threshold of his Ionic porch would encounter the same level of palatial splendour indoors. Jump forward to the year 1847, and Major Dennis Mahon decided that the only way he could deal with the terrible consequences of the potato blight and the ensuing famine on his land was to ship thousands of his starving tenants, many of them already suffering from cholera and typhus, off to Canada to become somebody else's problem. Needless to say, a very large number did not survive the journey. In November of that year, Major Mahon was shot dead by vengeful land agitators, and the name Strokestown acquired a notoriety that no amount of architectural embellishment could quite obscure. Until the late 20th century, that is, when Jim Callery, a local businessman whose company had purchased the house and what remained of the estate, decided that the best possible way of refurbishing the building and the reputation of Strokestown was, in a sense, to turn history on its head and establish at this place the National Irish Famine Museum, commemorating, examining and contextualising those catastrophic events that have left such scars on the national consciousness. But he didn't set out to do that. In 1976, Jim Callery's business, Westward Garages, had secured a big contract to distribute Scania trucks in Ireland, and he needed space to expand. His premises were built right up against the estate, which was at that time the home of Olive Hayes Pakenham Mahon, and they had at best a frosty relationship.
So there was no way that I could come down here and say I wanted to see Olive Hills, Beckingham and the Major, and that we were going to buy 4 or 5 acres or 6 acres. So with a lot of thought, we decided on a guy who had done work for such places like Strokestown Park, an auctioneer, they call him real estate agents now, Leslie Conboy, and we picked on this guy and we said to Leslie, will you talk to the people in Strokestown Park and see would they sell us 5 or 6 acres here? And he went down and he discussed it with them and he came back and said, no, there's no way. Now, at that time, we had put in a public address system above at the new garage, and they could obviously hear it here, and it was causing some annoyance.
You putting out music as well?
No, just calling people around the site,
I see.
and this was causing some distress,
Right.
which I suppose at my age now, you'd have to recognise.
You can understand.
I can understand. I wouldn't like if there was somebody at home and this calling people, but anyway, about fairly shortly afterwards, limited amount of time, the bridge lane, the girl on the switch called me and said, Madam Olive Hills, Beckingham man wants you to call down. And I said to Bridge, what does the owl ... want now?
Right.
And I arrived down, and Massey, the butler, met me at the door, and he brought me in there, and Olive was in there, and she gave me a seat, and she said, Mr. Callery, I believe you were interested in buying some land. Well, the position is that my son now, Nicholas, owns it, and it is going to be sold, and I think you should try to buy it. Well, I nearly fell down on the floor off the chair. I was full sure I was going to get the father and mother of a bullet over this address system.
And she was considering you as a serious buyer of the whole thing?
Yes.
Everything, house
Yes.
and domain and
Yes.
lands, everything.
The whole 300 acres and the house. It was the very most unlikely thing. I would have never dreamt that they would want us near the place, and I never dreamt that they might be interested in a local owner.
So, after a London auction that merits a story in its own right, Jim Callery and his colleagues found themselves the unlikely owners of a run-down stately house and 300 acres of domain, with no idea what to do with it apart from the few acres they needed for their own business. They had agreed that Olive and her husband, Major Hales, could continue to live in the house for as long as they wished. So when they were about to go on holiday, Jim asked if he might root around the contents of some of the rooms, which, after all, now belonged to him, and they readily agreed. In one room, he unearthed a huge pile of estate documents, and among them was something that would set him on a path that would lead to the establishment of the Famine Museum. It was a letter of petition written in the year 1846, addressed to Major Dennis Mahon, pleading with him for some kind of relief because the potato crop had failed. The petition was from the tenants of the townland of Clunahee.
Clunahee is the townland I was born in and the townland I still live in. So that had a huge, a massive emotional time. I read that not once as I sat at the desk, I read it 4 or 5 times.
And that's where the germ of the idea
And I
came
sat
from.
in there and I cried.
You and Olive became quite friendly ultimately.
I suppose as we get into old age, and I'm now old age, I'm nearly as old as Olive then, I suppose she might have been lonely, but she sent for me very regularly. And we, in the last number of years, we became quite friendly. And we were coming from totally different backgrounds. My mother's father, as a 12-year-old boy, had been evicted off the Dillon estate during the famine. So I would have had some connections. My mother, relayed this to me and the rest of us many times. My grandfather was born in 1834. So he died before I was born. So there was a direct route into what had happened.
Would you have inherited then a great resentment of the landlords?
The reality of this was that there was nobody in rural Ireland. We were all tenants, everybody was tenants that hadn't a huge resentment.
Whatever kind of cross-cultural empathy Jim and Olive were able to generate between themselves seemed to persuade her that the house in which she grew up and in which she had enjoyed such a happy and privileged childhood was now in good hands, while he was able to channel that ancestral resentment he spoke of into something much more benign and positive and ultimately of great practical value to the community at large. Jim Callery is not only a successful businessman, he's also a man of deep sensibility and a keen student of history. And he was able to persuade his fellow directors that rather than dispose of the house and contents and gardens for profit, they should refurbish and preserve 3 centuries of Irish history, architecture and craftsmanship as an educational resource for posterity and as a tourist attraction, with the key addition, of course, of the National Irish Famine Museum. It's nowadays cared for by the Irish Heritage Trust, and we'll be doing our own bit of rummaging through its nooks and crannies when we come back. There's a great deal more to see and to discuss about Strokestown House and Estate, and I'll be back through these gates very shortly. But let's not forget the town itself and the townspeople. I've been far-sighted enough to send a man ahead of me to film the ordinary folk of Strokestown and the countryside around going about their daily business. He went so far ahead of me that I wasn't even born when he started. But I'm very grateful for the pictures that he's left, as indeed are the people he filmed. Billy Chapman was a popular and respected member of the Strokestown community back in the 1940s, despite the fact that he probably spoke with an accent similar to mine, because he was born and bred in Derry City, as indeed was I. His mother came from Strokestown originally, but his father was an RIC officer from Galway who was transferred to Derry in the year 1900. And there, 2 years later, Billy Chapman was born in 9 Princess Terrace, which is just around the corner from the place that I work when I'm not on my travels, so I can tell you with some authority that 9 Princess Terrace is a tiny house, much too small to accommodate the 11 children that the Chapmans eventually had. So, as soon as he could, Billy left home with his parents' blessing, and first of all went to work as a riveter in the Belfast shipyards before coming to Strokestown to learn the plastering trade from his uncle Paddy Harris. Then he went back to Derry to get the boat to America, where he worked as a decorative plasterer in those fancy Art Deco buildings that everybody was building back in the 1930s. He came back to Strokestown in 1936, and after doing a bit more fancy plaster work on the new Magnet Ballroom, Billy did the thing for which he will always be fondly remembered in Strokestown. He gave the people of the town a Christmas present, because on the 22nd of December 1940, he opened the Club Cinema, next door to his mother's old home in Church Street. And Billy had a way of ensuring that he always had a packed house. Yes, they would flock into the cinema to see Laurence Olivier and Vivien Leigh in the main feature. But the real stars of the silver screen they had come to see were themselves. Many changes have taken place since the 1940s when Billy Chapman was making his films. But perhaps the most culturally significant one is that few local people back then would have been regular or welcome visitors to the domain at the end of Bond Street. All that has changed utterly. Nowadays the owners welcome, want, indeed need visitors and volunteers. When Jim Callery and his fellow directors of Westford took ownership of Strokestown House, they also took on a lot of structural and maintenance problems that could only be solved with money, hard work, expertise, and a bottomless well of goodwill. A great deal has been achieved, but the effort is ongoing, and it's not just confined to the house. The grounds and the gardens also required expert and dedicated attention. That's how John O'Driscoll first became involved here. He started as head gardener and is now manager of the whole shebang. John, if you go inside the house now and walk around all of the rooms, you know, and the furnished rooms now I'm talking about, it's as if people just left last week. Isn't that the case? I mean, all the personal belongings and things sitting around the place. Yeah. Is that the effect that you want to keep in the place? Yeah?
Absolutely. That's exactly what it is, Joe. We really wanted the house to just stop in time, almost as it was left by the family. Of course, we had to get rid of all those awful things like dry rot and dampness and problems like that, re-roof the house and make it safe, but just stop it. So as you wander through the house, everything is there. Right. The photographs, children's toys, fabulous children's toys. As I often said to somebody, everything right down to the chamber pot still exists in the house. The house is amazing. Like, there are pieces in the house from the mid-1600s right up to the 1980s, a full social history of the house. Around the 50s, Olive Mahon and her husband hired a young lady architect from Roscommon town, asking her to change the kitchen, rip out all the old ranges and build a new kitchen into the stone arches of the fireplaces.
For practicality? For
practicality. It just made sense. No one could run all those old ranges and stuff. So thank goodness she said no. She could never do it to such a beautiful old kitchen. Right. So she built a false wall in front of the old ranges and a false ceiling to just under the gallery. And as she said, she built a box, and inside this box she built a new kitchen. So when work began, sledgehammers were taken out, holes broke, heads put through, and there it was, covered in cobwebs and grime.
Was it breaking into Tutankhamun's tomb or something like that?
Completely, a fabulous gallery kitchen. It's the best preserved kitchen of its type in Ireland anyway today. Right. And I think the modern history, the story of Olive Mahon says so much in the house. She was the last member of the family to live in the house. She left in 1981, died shortly after that. But when you look at her story, on the mantelpiece in the library we have an invitation to Buckingham Palace from 1933 when she presented her daughter at court, and sitting next to that a photograph of Olive dressed for Buckingham Palace in feathers and trains. So you're getting that whole life of the big house when you go in there. It's another unique thing about Strokestown House. You go into the house, you see the grandeur of the house, the fabulous furniture, the furnishings, the French wallpaper in the library, everything there. But I suppose when you also look at it, and I've often said this, it's been preserved almost as it was left by the family. It's faded grandeur.
Yes.
It's kind of the end of the ascendancy in Ireland.
Right.
And so you're getting two amazing stories, two very different stories. The story of the big house and what it was like for the people living outside the walls and the gates of the estate, in particular during the Great Irish Famine.
So, I mean, there's two museums, in other words. You've got the Famine Museum, which is a modern creation, so to speak. And right beside it you have the sort of the living museum of the big house.
Absolutely, and it's kind of almost ironic that when you go into the first room of the Famine Museum, if you look out the window, you can see it's sitting in the shadow of the big house.
As John and I talk in the grounds outside, Ruth Lanigan coordinates the efforts of Irish Heritage Trust volunteers on the inside, carefully confining the dust of centuries and, in some cases, simply maintaining the decorous dilapidation of fragile mementos of times past. Yes, these could also be from the store of antique objects found in the big house, but they're not. These are thoroughly modern croquet mallets and balls, as indeed are the sporting volunteers who have dressed themselves so elegantly and appropriately for the occasion. Unlike me, it was far from croquet lawns I was reared. You might think that would also apply to my Irish-American companions, Jim Hoban and Grace Rickard, who have organised today's proceedings. But no, in California, where they spend only half their lives these days, croquet is a popular and entirely democratic pastime, they tell me. That's the image of the thing I wanted to talk about as well. I mean, it is associated, right?
It's associated
in this country with the big houses, with the landlord class, the landed gentry and so on.
That's right, because
and
they
here
were
we are, and here we are in Strokestown with the Famine Museum, which has got a big question mark against them, and here we are aping them.
Yes, that's right.
Is there an irony in that, or
yes,
are you aware of that?
Absolutely.
You know, we have difficulty getting men to join into the game because they think it's a game for just rich people.
Yes.
Because
Yeah.
it was associated with the big house and
Yeah.
things of that sort.
Absolutely.
So it's
it
hard
has
to get
kind
them to
But
come
the
in.
interesting thing is that the game actually originated here in Ireland.
Yeah.
And by a gentleman that had gone to the continent and seen this playing, the people
servants
playing
were
with,
playing.
with just wooden hoops. And he said, that looks like a good game. So he came back here and he actually developed it. Now, obviously it was it's still in the context of the big house, but then it moved from here to England.
Ah, right.
So
I see.
it does have a tradition here.
Okay. So, and it started off as if you like, a working class sport because
Yes.
it was the servants who started playing. it
Yes,
first.
that was in
That
France.
was in France, but
See,
when
it
it
had-
came
the
over
name
here,
croquet is French, and
Of
so you would
course.
wonder why, did they invent it? Well, they did, but we refined it here.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And I imagine in California it's a very democratic kind of a sport as well. Everybody can play.
Yes, of
And
course.
it doesn't have those associations
Not at all.
all.
No,
Ah,
no.
Right, right.
Ah.
Right. The two Americans are showing us up a wee bit. Do you notice that? Oh, would you look at that. She's a hustler, this woman.
Yeah, that's right.
The name Strokestown is derived from the Irish Bail Ahan na Mully, meaning the forward mouth of the strokes. This was a reference to the clash of swords in ancient clan battles, but perhaps it could equally apply to the clash of croquet mallets.
Good shot! Wow!
He's close in now.
Wow! Strut a bit. Hey!
Very good.
Congratulations.
2 or 3 points.
I got 2 points.
2
Thank you,
points.
Emily.
Good.
I think Grace won.
There,
Well done,
very
John.
good, Joe.
Well done. Okay. Right. We have to have this is gin and tonic up in the.
Oh, yeah.
We'll have stuff. Yes.